At 6 o'clock in the morning, on a fine summer's day, Bournemouth Beach is peaceful enough. It's a nice place to be. This view will soon be completely transformed, because these beaches are used to stage a number of events, many of which attract enormous crowds. I shall be filming some of those events. For almost 50 years, I produced films and television programs around the world. I've rarely found myself doing the same thing 2 days running, or even being in the same place. Every day has brought a new challenge, with new subjects to capture for posterity and new people to meet along the way. I've written a book about the experiences I've had, in case anyone wants to know what happened on and off screen when the films were made. My interest in film goes back a long way. When I first started, I was slightly younger than I am today. I went to school each morning on the back of my mother's motorbike. We didn't have a car until many years later, when I started my first job. When I moved to Milton Abbey, then a new school which had just opened, my housemaster lent me a movie camera which was his pride and joy. It was powered by a clockwork motor, which, when it was fully wound up, ran just long enough to capture 30 seconds of film. I used it to make a very amateur film, and things went on from there. When the school caught fire, I was able to show how Dorset Fire Brigade managed to stop the blaze just yards away from the Abbot's Hall and other rooms full of priceless treasures. When I left school, I got my first job working for J. Arthur Rank, the man with the gong, whose films had entertained us during our school days. While I was working there, I heard that the BBC were planning to run a training course for people who wanted to learn how to make television programs. I wrote for an application form and sat back and waited. For months. 3 months, actually. Then, when I'd almost given up hope, I received a booklet and a letter apologising for the delay and explaining that there were 5 vacancies for trainees on the course, and they'd had over 2,000 applicants. 2 more months and a memorable interview later, I heard that I'd somehow managed to get one of those jobs, and the 3-year contract that went with it, and I was told to report for work at Ealing Studios. I arrived on the same day as another new recruit. His name was David Attenborough, and in the cutting rooms where I began my training, he was working on his first ZooQuest program. From Ealing, I moved eventually to Lime Grove, where Alfred Hitchcock had made some of his early films. There, I worked on Tonight, a groundbreaking topical magazine program which went out live 5 nights a week. As a trainee, I was attached to the normal production teams of each of the programs I was sent to work on. So I saw them and joined in doing a lot of different jobs, and learnt my lessons live as the programs went on air, from the best writers, directors and technicians who made them work. They included Cliff Mitchellmore, Alan Wicker and Hugh Weldon, just 3 of the people who would go on to great things later on in life. From Tonight, I moved to Panorama, where Richard Dimbleby was in charge, and he gave me many more priceless tips. It was at Lime Grove that I learnt my first lessons about working with actors. Many of the biggest stars of the day were based there. They included Tony Hancock, who I first saw in action on the day he made one of his most famous programmes, The Blood Donor, a show which, for reasons which I've explained in my books, very nearly never got made. From Lime Grove, I moved up the road to what was then the world's newest and best equipped television studio, the new BBC Television Centre. I spent several years there working on many of the BBC's most popular programmes. It was at about this time that I wrote my first book. One of the film industry's trade magazines at that time asked me to write a series of articles about the work I was doing. People seemed to like them, and in due course, the Focal Press, who were the world's biggest major publisher of books on films and television, asked me to write a book for them. It worked out okay, and was reprinted, updated and revised several times, and translated into several languages. Other publishers then asked me to write for them, and I'm still doing that today. But it's one book above all others which changed my life forever, and this is how that came about. It's 100 years since these scenes were filmed. They were shot on basic equipment by pioneers who wanted to record some of the battles fought during the First World War. That war lasted for 5 years. Towns and villages were wiped out and thousands of people died. In 1914, the Flemish market town of Ypres was home to 16,000 people. It was here that some of the fiercest battles of the war were fought. Those who survived rarely spoke about what happened here. This man, like many others who served in the trenches, would never discuss the war, even with me, and he was my father. When the war ended, after a year spent in hospital after a dugout he was in received a direct hit, he decided to make some notes about the extraordinary experiences he'd had in the 4 years he'd spent under fire in the trenches. When he finished, he put his notes away in an old cabin trunk. As he never told anyone he'd written anything, they stayed where he put them for 91 years. It was only then, when I decided to move house and clear out my garage, that his amazing story came to light. There were piles of films, grandfather clocks, and a number of cabin trunks which no one could ever remember opening. They were found to contain photographs, letters and bills going back 3 generations. It took me 2 years to restore the photographs, transcribe his words, and add a brief introduction to bring them up to date. I then arranged for some copies to be printed as a limited edition book. Here is a little of what it revealed. It was at Ypres, where I had to lead my men across a swamp towards a forward trench. As we moved forward, a German aeroplane suddenly appeared. It swooped down over our heads and machine-gunned us. I flopped down, hoping the earth might open and swallow us up. But it was then that I discovered that I'd flopped on the partly buried body of a man who'd evidently been lying in the sun for some time. The trenches were now so full of dead bodies that it was impossible to move without treading on them. The silence was oppressive. I was approached by a young signaller. He said he was the only man from the battalion headquarters who was still alive. "Have I your permission to retire, sir?" he asked, rather formally. "Oh, there doesn't seem to be much to stay here for," "Does there?" I replied. As I hurried along, the shelling started again, and I hoped I'd continue to be lucky. That book has been reprinted several times, and it's now been revised and expanded and combined with an updated account of my own activities in television. The new book tells our complete family's story. It's really 2 books for the price of 1. Over the years, we've continued to make programs and record the activities of some of the most prominent people around. We've also been able to preserve for posterity the unique talents of some very special people, many of whom, alas, are no longer around. In the few minutes available in this introductory film, it has of course been impossible to give a real impression of the many extraordinary things I've been involved in over the years, and in the books you'll find the full story is generally there. For today, I'm going to leave the last word to a friend of mine, a world-class raconteur, and one of the nicest people I've ever had the privilege of working with. He and my crew spent several days at his home in Mallorca, in the course of which he told me about the days he'd spent during the war, times he'd hated, and where his many irreplaceable talents were completely ignored.
We were supposed to attack Maidstone in order to test the efficiency of the Home Guard there. And I decided that I would detach myself from my main unit and enter Maidstone alone. So I dropped off the brain gun carrier, and I got into the middle of Maidstone by the device, which I thought shrewd, of knocking on people's doors, saying it's a military maneuver. At the height of the war, they weren't going to be angry. They let me in, and then I went out of their back door, crossed the garden, and knocked on somebody else's back door, and then came out into the street, looked both ways, rushed across the street, knocked on somebody else's front door, and quite alone I entered the center of Maidstone, where I shot by saying bang, the head of the defending army, a general in the Home Guard, and he refused to die. And the umpire had a terrible stutter. He was a lieutenant. And he said, "You're dead, sir."
I've never, this young man, I'm not, no, I'm not.
I'm terribly sorry, sir, but you are quite dead.
I won't.
And he became really like a child. I mean, I was just standing there, so then they took me prisoner. First of all, they decided I was dead, too, because that was the compensation for the general.
I would have been able to shoot him before he,
and all this business. So I was taken into a guard room, and I was told I was dead. Then I was led in for interrogation, and I said, "Just a minute, you want to decide whether I'm dead or not." So then they took out emptied all my pockets and started reading my correspondence. When they did that, I only answered in German. They got tremendously suspicious, and they locked me into the armory. Very intelligent. So I immediately stole a Bren gun and shot my way out of there because I was sure the umpire was there. I said, "Is the umpire there?" Bub, 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 bub. And eventually they all pounced on me, and I managed to upset the table of the head general. The ink was all over the place. And I was sent back in disgrace to my unit, where the colonel said, "What was all that for?" And I said, "I don't know, sir. I take this thing seriously, and I only answered in German because I don't think that you're going to get many English-speaking prisoners. I was trying to test them."
Very good. Yes, very good. I got completely the wrong impression.
Good. Carry on. And he became my champion then.